Okay.
Yes.
Hello, everybody. Manos is just going to get his chamomile tea, and then you will be along shortly. We're very calm prayers. We're going to talk for a while about some tips on adjudicating BP debates. This will not be a 1.5 hour long session, so you'll have some free time. I'm going to try to keep it as short as possible. How many of you have judged BP debates before? How many of you have seen BP format debating as a speaker or as an observer? How many of you know what the format involves? Okay. So you already know how to do the judging if you've seen the format. It's pretty simple. BP is a 4-team, 2-on-2 format with 2 speakers on each team. There's some specifics in adjudicating British parliamentary that are different to adjudicating straight 1v1 debates. Those are the short diagonal and the long diagonal. So the decisions between first proposition and second opposition, and first opposition and second proposition. People kind of get a little bit scared about judging BP debates because there's no direct clash between those teams. So often judges who aren't used to the format find it difficult to compare or to decide or to decide between those teams. Okay. Okay, no problem. Either the workshop or it's just put them in the works. So what I'm going to do is go through the way that I judge BP debates, and hopefully that will help you solve those diagonal questions for yourselves. Before I get started, I just want to say that adjudicating is an incredibly subjective exercise. There isn't a right or a wrong way to judge debates. There isn't a right or a wrong way to judge BP debates. If there were, we would have settled this a long time ago, rather than constantly rewriting adjudication guidelines for every single tournament that we have. So this is just my presentation of what I think the adjudication guidelines for BP are. Different people will tell you different things. And what I'm going to say is some of the reasons why some of those other ways of judging BP are completely incorrect. But you should kind of take everything that I'm saying as being correct with a little bit of a grain of salt yourself as well. So first thing, what are the 3 important things when you're judging a BP debate? These are the 3 kind of paradigms that I look at. This is like a train station. These are the 3 things that I look at when I'm judging BP debates in terms of a team's impact. The first one is their argument. What is the substantive material that this team has brought to the debate in and of themselves? Secondly, I look at that team's clash. How has this team rebutted arguments from other teams? How have they engaged with material from their opposition speakers? How have they developed their arguments in response to stuff that opposition speakers have said? And thirdly, I look at role. Now, when I say I look at role, I never want to hear an adjudicator say to me in adjudication anything about role fulfillment, or I thought the first proposition didn't have a strong enough model, so they didn't fulfill their role, therefore they can't win. There is no such thing, he says on camera, as a set role or a set way to fulfill a role in a British parliamentary speech. By that I mean, you can't ever write down on paper what a perfect first proposition speech will be, because different propositions will suit different motions, or different speakers suit different ways of delivering proposition speeches. So there isn't necessarily a right or a wrong way. There are some things in relation to role that are important, but don't fall into the trap of poor adjudicators by adjudicating based on what you think the rulebook for BP is. This format is completely insane. The only reason that we use it in competition is it's the best method to get as many people into one room debating as possible. It's not because it's a good format, it's not because it's a particularly clear format, it's because Worlds and Euros got too big and they needed something that allowed them to accommodate them in the size universities that were bidding to host the tournaments. But the format that you debate in isn't important if you look at these three things. And these are rules or lessons that you can take regardless of what format you're adjudicating in, be it World Schools, or Karl Popper, or policy debate, or any of the other formats that are out there, inferior formats, because they don't get as many people into one room. So firstly, let's look at argument. Does anybody have any ideas what makes an argument good or what makes an argument bad? You're supposed to be my assistant. You're not supposed to just sit there with your chamomile.
The judge's opinion.
The judge's opinion? How can you tailor an argument for the judge's opinion if you're a team?
You need to know your judge. If you don't, this is good.
Okay, so if you've got a psychic connection with your judge and you can deliver the Superman argument that you know they wrote their thesis on, that's great. But in reality, that's not going to be something that you can do a lot, particularly at a tournament like this. For example, if you're coaching kids here, you're not going to be able to go up to them before they go into their room and say, you have Manos, he likes brief fiscal austerity arguments, so make sure you make loads of those. Or you've got Stevens, he likes potatoes, make potato jokes. What you have to try to do in terms of building, or what you're looking for in terms of building an argument, is the kind of stuff that we coach in argumentation development. So the reason that the coaching syllabus is developed in the way that it is it's kind of our idea of how all of these things should fit together. How you develop an argument, how you create case material, how you show the value of your argument, and you want to kind of pass it through that sieve or that lens as you're evaluating an argument. So the first step is the argument clear? Is there a clear statement of the intent or the purpose that the team or speaker has in the next kind of minute of their speech? Is this something that they've thought about and they've put together, or is it just this random like word fountain that happens to have come together into one cogent sentence at the end, which kind of sounds a little bit like the motion on one side or the other? You want to look at whether or not this clarity is there throughout the entire argument, and that's the second thing that you're looking for. You want them to develop the argument and explain it. Do they start from a very simple premise? The argument that I want to make on this motion about the EU budget being set by the European Central Bank and that passing on to all individual countries is that Greece is unable to financially manage itself. I'm going to develop that argument by looking at these three circumstances where Greece has financially not managed itself. Last Tuesday, last Wednesday, and last Thursday. And then we're going to talk about the effects that that has. That shows development in the argument. It's not just, I don't know why I'm picking on Greece, it's because you're drinking chamomile tea. It's not just showing I have an assertion that's randomly stated. It is, this is an argument that I want to develop and I want to show evidence to support. The third thing that you want to look at in terms of the argument is how they connect it back into the motion. So linkage of the argument is important as well. By demonstrating that linkage, they show the value of the argumentation that they've made themselves, and they also tie themselves back into the debate. One of the most common things that I hear from novice judges is, I didn't understand the connection between that point and the wider argument that they were trying to make, or I didn't understand the connection between that point and the motion itself. And you want to reward people who take those steps for you, who make it easier to decide the debate. Now, that's not saying that making it easy to decide the debate is better than having really clever, really developed argumentation, but it is a factor that you need to bring into consideration. Remember, as an adjudicator, you want to put yourself into a position where you are a barely functional observer. You have no specific knowledge or information beyond that of the average reasonable voter. The reasonable voter probably being somebody who might watch the news occasionally, maybe reads a paper once every month if they feel particularly academic that day, and has a passing knowledge of current affairs, of social policy, of international relations and trade, of whatever the debate's about. In this case, this weekend, a very passing knowledge of the European Union. Because that's what we're trying to do with this pastime. It's not convincing a group of experts. It's about building skills that can be used to convince the general public or a wide audience to agree or disagree with your particular proposal. At its very essence, debating is entirely boiled down to the activities of politicians in a parliament, and that's kind of what you want them to replicate here. In exactly the same way as the economics Nobel laureate standing in a House of Parliament explaining stuff with very complicated terminology not really explaining the connection back to the general principle or the general purpose behind what they're doing, and not showing any connection to the ordinary person won't be persuasive and won't be voted back in. Unless they show clear developed linked argumentation in their speeches, they're not going to be persuasive to the ordinary individual either. So you want to reward that insofar as possible. The second thing is clash, and clash is an important thing to assess in this case. So clash is not only the response to the argument that's directly across the table from you, i.e. from first proposition to first opposition, or backwards in terms of rebuttal, but also how well interwoven their clash is to the rest of their speech generally. So are they taking argumentation that they have, substantive developed argumentation, and using that to provide clash with stuff that the proposition or opposition teams have given you? Are they developing clash throughout their speeches, or do they just have 3 or 4 minutes of pre-packaged material with some rebuttal tacked on at the start and some summary stuff at the end? The reason the clash is important is twofold. Firstly, it shows the interaction between you and opposition material, so it shows where you think your material is better, and it shows where you're willing to take on opposition material. But also, it shows that you're constantly listening and constantly tailoring your speech. The other thing that you don't want to have happening, and that you don't want to reward as an adjudicator, is the kind of a speaker who takes the 15 minutes preparation time, writes their full speech, and then gets up and recites that full speech regardless of what's happened before them in the debate. British parliamentary debating, and the way that it's structured, is supposed to kind of engender that adaptive debating and discursive debating. So again, by evaluating clash, you're going to see that kind of adaptation and that interaction a little bit clearer. The third thing that you want to look at is role. And like I said earlier, it's not necessarily a question of role fulfillment, but it's a question of fulfilling the particular role that you have on the table in a non-kind of binding way, but sometimes it's binding. So what do I mean by that? First proposition will always have to set the parameters for the debate, so they have to give you their definition, their framing of the debate, what it is we're talking about. It's structured in that they have to have these elements. It's unstructured in they don't have to have as their first point, this is the framework for the debate. The second point is my Oxford English Dictionary definition of financial austerity, the European Union, the word the, and clouds. You don't have to be prescriptive in terms of this stuff, but you have to at least hint towards it in your speeches. Similarly, first opposition, you want to have a lot of rebuttal material from that first opposition speaker. You want them to attack what first proposition is done straight away. And you almost value that slightly more, the constructive material, because it shows a more reactive approach to debating. In second half, you want to see extensions from both of the first speakers, both from second proposition first speaker and second opposition first speaker. And in terms of extension, there's a really easy test for finding whether or not there's an extension. You just ask yourself, is any of the material that they have said in those two positions substantially new or substantially different from what the previous two speakers have said before? And if it is, has the team realized that themselves and made enough of a deal of their new material? Because it's not sufficient just to have new material, but you also have to show that you understand this is new and important material in the debate as well. Again, that's probably the most personally difficult position. That's a very strong position of mine. Other people will tell you that there isn't a requirement for people to flag up their new material. The reason that I think it's important to flag up your new material is sometimes idiots can accidentally get it right, and I don't like rewarding idiots. So I like to see the teams realizing, in the same way as I like to see up here, the teams realizing the value of their points. I like them to see the newness and their role fulfillment in those positions as well. And then in terms of the two summation speakers, the obvious one is no new material. The difficulty is there's no easy test for what is or isn't new material, because technically the rules say that new material is allowed if it's in reference to or rebuttal of a previously existing argument. So in that case, almost anything can be framed as refutation or rebuttal, and you can bring in entirely new developed lines of argument which respond to material from the opposition side. In reality, it's a bit of a smell it and see test, because it's kind of like the famous adage about pornography. I don't know what pornography is, but I know it when I see it. And you know when new material is presented in the summation speech. It's kind of, it's not just that it's new material, but it's willfully new material that's designed only to be not responded to by the opposition side. And it applies equally on both sides. The proposition summary speaker nor the opposition summary speaker can bring in substantially new material or a substantial amount of new material. Now, with that said, again, it's kind of, it's flexible in terms of the role. If some of the stuff about the model comes up in the second speech, that can sometimes be okay if the first speech has a lot of technical issues that they need to get through, or if the first speech has a lot of the answers to the why questions, then the second speech can deal with the how sometimes. If you're in doubt, there's a reason that you're never going to be on an adjudication panel on your own. There's a reason that this format is slightly strange in that it allows discussion before a result is reached. In World Schools, and I think in Karl Popper, there's no discussion before a vote. I should really know, I run Karl Popper things there. There's no discussion before the vote. But in BP, it's about that discussion, and I'll talk in a little bit about how to get the most out of the discussion as a panelist and how to get the most out of a panelist as a chair. But what I'm trying to get at is role fulfillment will never be a reason, or a lack of role fulfillment will never be a reason to give somebody a lower grade if the other two things are done well or done to a decent standard. So those are the three things I look for. Does anybody have any questions on that stuff? Yeah?
And just for the argument, on the subpoints you have listed there in order of importance. For example, could you consider clarity more important than leakage?
No, I think that the three of them are equally important. Like I don't think that there's a requirement to have one or to have one above others. And it's not necessarily that I think that there's 20 marks for this and 10 marks for this. I just think those are indicators that the argumentation is good. You might have your own indicator for where you think the argument is good.
Well, I would think that clarity on its own is not a very important factor, but the effects of it are.
Yeah, exactly. So it's about seeing how all of these apply. You could have a very well linked argument, but if the argument is terrible, it doesn't matter how well it's linked. Likewise, you could have a very well developed argument that just has no connection with the debate. So it's all kind of, it's different things that feed into it being a good argument rather than if something is incredibly clear, it's very strong. The actual metrics of British parliamentary are important as well. The first thing is, there is no such thing in BP as an automatic last. There is nothing that you can do in a BP debate that guarantees that you're going to take a zero. Even if you stand up for 35 seconds, talk gibberish at the wall and sit back down, you can't ever at the end of that person's speech decide if that team is taking a last, because either A, the next team could do something even worse than that, or B, somebody could be grossly offensive or violent in a room. Everything has to be weighed up in comparison to each other, and that's an important part of your decision-making process. So, how do you reach a decision in a BP debate?
I have a question about it. But, I hope this will never be a question in real life. What if one team is like being aggressive, one team is being offensive, and one team doesn't speak up anything, and there's, I don't know, fourth team which does something else which is really, really bad, then what will I do then?
Yeah, you're right, that's never going to happen. This is, that's the thing. Just put the man in the room. Regardless of what you do so regardless of what happens in a room, you rank all of the teams in the order that you find them most persuasive, or in the order that you think is so that's the way that I decide on debates. Other people have a different way to say to encapsulate in their heads like who won and who lost. In my head, it's always who had the most effect on the debate. So who did I find most persuasive? For stuff that's overly aggressive or overly insulting or overly bad, you just don't find that persuasive material. So where someone is insulting to another team, that's not good rebuttal, it's not good argumentation. So it doesn't have a negative impact, but it can't have a positive impact on that person's speech. At the end of all of the speeches, you will have an idea of who had the most positive an impact, and you rank the teams based on that. But if you're in a situation where you have somebody who's aggressive, or somebody who's overly rude, or somebody who is overly insulting, you would rank the teams in the order that they came in the debate, and then immediately go and find the equity officer or the tournament director, because you are going to be spending a lot of time talking to people that you just see that route. You may, to be fair, like it can happen in a bin room where people don't think there's any chance of them progressing in the competition. It can happen in very poor competitions if somebody has misunderstood the motion and taken a person in the front to it. In very poor rooms in a competition, excuse me, rather than very poor competitions. So that kind of stuff can happen, but it happens incredibly rarely, and you will never have the nuclear option of 4 teams going crazy at once, or at least you shouldn't. If you do, maybe think of taking up a new hobby, you're clearly cursed. So in terms of decisions, once the last speaker has finished up and you've gotten everyone to cross the floor and get out of the room, you have 15 minutes. Except you don't really have 15 minutes, because that includes the time that you're going to have to be telling the runner that you're only going to be another 2 minutes, the time that you have to fill in the ballot, the time that you have to add up all of the speaker scores, and the time that you have to redo the addition of the speaker scores because you accidentally got the arts student to do all the addition, and they can't count past 10 unless they take off their shoes. So in reality, what you have in terms of your decision process is about 10 to 12 minutes. The first thing that you should do is give everybody a minute or two to read over their notes and make their own reflections on the debate, to come to their own decisions. Now, what I do in this stage, or at this stage, is I have my notes either on a laptop or on a sheet of paper. I will take an entirely separate sheet of paper from my original debate notes, in the same as if I was recording people's initial calls. I'll make a cross. And then in 2 different color pens, I will write down positive and negative comments on each of the individual teams. So this might be good structure, good engagement, and then if there's a particularly strong point, like, I don't know, Greece. But then if there's something that they've done badly, like a poor model, or badly explained, I'll also make note of that, so that when we get back around to the discussion of what's happened in the debate, I don't have to constantly flick back and forth to my notes to refer to why I came to the decision that I did. My initial call will be someplace in here, by the way, so that I can always keep track of where I originally was. I am never completely married to that initial call. That can change based on what other people in the room are saying, my realization about the value of an argument after it's been trashed out a little bit, the realization that something wasn't as strong in the debate as I have made it in my head, so I have to take some of the value off that. So everything is changeable, but this just gives me the reason behind my initial call, so it's easier to refer back to it in terms of the discussion. Try to get through that as quickly as possible, and I would do the initial ranking first, and then spend most of the time on the explanation on the teams that you think came first and the teams that you think came last, because those will be the other way around, or the teams that you think came second or third, because that's often going to be the tightest call, and it's easier to kind of have a gut feeling about the first and the fourth. So I like to try to explain more closely why I think the second and the third went the particular way that it did. After the 2 minutes or so are up, it's time to get people's initial calls. So after 2 minutes, you just go around the room and ask the other judges what they think. If you're in a position where you're in the chair and you have a wing judge who's a very well-known judge, very widely respected, it's clearly a very important room, and this person has been put on the panel with you in order to make sure that the correct decision is made, don't go to that person first for their initial call. If the third judge is slightly more novice, or is somebody who you know has a lot of potential, but maybe doesn't have as much experience. By going with somebody who's seen to have a name or be known as an adjudicator, you're setting up that person's decision as being the correct call, or as being a more important call than the other person's call. So as much as it puts them on the spot, I will always ask who I perceive to be the most novice judge in the room or on the panel to give their decision first. Now, it's not an exact science because you can never know every judge, but just watch out for it where you have kind of, insofar as you can have a superstar judge in debating. If it's you, Mano, and some 12-year-old Irish kid, go with the 12-year-old Irish kid first so that Mano can't frighten them into agreeing with him. It's not necessarily that you want to form an allegiance against Mano, but you don't want to have one form in favour of a particular call without having any justification for that call, because sometimes Mano gets it wrong, in the same way that sometimes we can all get it wrong, and it's best to try to eliminate that as much as possible. Similarly to that, never give your own call first. It shows arrogance and it shows disrespect, and it's just you going, you better agree with me or you're getting terrible feedback. I try insofar as possible to never give an initial call if I'm in the chair, because I don't want people to just agree with me. I will have my call in my head and I'll have a particular way that I want to steer the discussion, but I will never start off by going, well, they clearly won and they clearly came last, let's talk about second and third. If that's how it's looking from the rest of the panel, I'd agree and get those results locked in and then move on to the other two positions, but I'll never try to influence a panel by giving my call and then asking people to agree. It's a little bit like filling out your feedback form and then just giving it to the adjudicators to sign. So move to somebody else, start with the least senior judge or the least experienced judge as you perceive it, and then move back around and don't give your own initial call. On another sheet of paper, depending on the number of judges, I will have a series of little crosses where I can keep track of what people's initial calls are. And that can sometimes freak out the other judges because it makes them think that I'm keeping track of where their calls were and where their calls changed, but that's not what I'm doing. What I'm actually doing here is trying to figure out where the discussion needs to be led, so I know if Jordi called a first, second, third, fourth, Mano called a first, third, second, first, and I called a first, third, second, fourth. I know that we've got agreement on the first place, so we should have a quick discussion about that, but we can probably see that one away pretty quickly. I know that there's more people who think that the second place goes to first opposition than any other position, and I know that this judge thinks that it's on the opposition but it's between the two for the second and third. So I know that there's probably a little bit of discussion that can be had there to swing that around. I know that nobody thinks that anybody in the back half took a first, so we can talk about the third and fourth. It becomes kind of complicated, but it doesn't actually at all. I just am really shit at keeping track of these things in my head, or trying to quantify. Yeah, I'm going to make sure that this can't ever be used in the video by swearing as much as possible. But it allows you to keep track of where people are standing and allows you to keep track of the discussion that you want to have. I'm also very cautious at this stage to remind the judges that their initial calls aren't binding. I want their gut feeling. I want them to give me what they think rather than what they know, and that we can have a discussion about it, because we have, at this stage, still got 8 to 10 minutes to chat about it. If here you have any clear results, so as in this case, we've got a first for first proposition, have a really quick chat about why everyone thinks that's a first. If it's good reasoning behind the first, if you think that the arguments for giving the first proposition the first are solid, responsible decisions that you can stand over when every other team comes up to you on break night and starts crying on your shoulder, then write that position in and move on to somebody else. The more you can eliminate decisions from an adjudication process, the more time you have for more contentious decisions as they happen. Remember as well that you're not writing this in the ballot paper yet. So if, as you're discussing second and third, you realize that the first opposition actually had a much higher impact on the debate than any of you have previously given them credit for, you can change your mind around again. None of these are locked-in decisions until the very end of the process has been reached. But what you're doing is you're eliminating a discussion that you need to have. So rather than wanting to have 4 different discussions about 4 different kind of clashes and teams, you're boiling it down constantly so you can concentrate on the positives of individual teams rather than constantly talking about the debate as a whole. So, important questions to ask at this stage, because again, you don't want to dictate. You never want to ask open-ended questions. But you want to ask people to justify their initial decisions or to talk about why they came to these initial decisions. So it might be something as simple as, can you tell me why you put first place above second place? Can you tell me why you put third place above fourth place? But those are the key questions to ask, because in an adjudication, everything is going to be comparative. All of the decisions that you make are referencing one team to another team, rather than taking individual teams in isolation. So you want to talk about why first proposition beats first opposition, why first proposition brings more to the table than second proposition, so that when it comes down to explaining the result to the teams, you're actually giving them meaningful feedback. You also want to concentrate on their argumentation at this stage. You're looking at the material that they bring to the debate and how they use that material, rather than initial impressions and style and the way that they present themselves. Because that's what's more useful to teams. Adjudication isn't just about finding the team that wins and putting them in a final and making them fight against the other three good teams. Adjudication is about teaching the skills that individual debaters or teams need to develop themselves in terms of their own performance as well. Otherwise it would just be a really blind, really simple test. There'd be no feedback, there'd be no discussion. By having a discussion and by having a feedback loop, you change what adjudicators do from just a simple empirical kind of a 1, 2, 3, 4 to a here's why. And the why isn't to make the debaters feel better, it's to give them something that they can build on and that they can improve on. So you need to be asking those types of questions. If you don't have any clear consensus in terms of positions, there are other questions that you can ask that are more general. How much did first proposition put on the table? How much development was there from second proposition? What was the opposition clash to that point like? What was the opposition constructive material? By going back to those initial things that we talked about, the three factors in terms of deciding a debate, you can kind of guide an adjudication where there isn't necessarily as much consensus as you might like. There will always be cases, though, where at the end of this kind of a discussion, or any kind of a discussion, you're going to be in a situation where 3 different judges, or 5 different judges, or if you're on a final panel, 7 or 9 different judges, have entirely different calls and entirely different reasons. And people often ask why final panels go on for as long as they do. The last 2 Euros finals panels have gone on for over 6 hours in total between the two of them, about 3 hours each. The reason isn't because it's a difficult decision to make, or that they're being managed poorly by the chair of the adjudication panel. I think the Euros final in Galway was superbly well chaired. What's happening in those situations are people are becoming more and more entrenched in particular positions that maybe aren't something that actually happened in the debate. People are being dragged away from the value of the argument as it happened in the room. Once you get past the discussion of the argument, once you've talked about a debate for 3 times longer than the debate's gone on, you're not talking about that debate anymore. You're talking about what you thought that debate was about rather than what it actually was about. So in a way, the 15-minute limit is actually really useful because it keeps you in the speeches that happen. You need to watch out for a couple of things as an adjudicator. The first one is you need to watch out for people adding additional kind of value to an argument. People saying, I thought that argument about Irish independence was incredibly interesting. I mean, I know they said that Irish independence happened in 1920, but I think what they were actually getting at was the drafting of the Irish Constitution in 1922, in particular the enumeration of the rights of the Catholic Church, was incredibly important in terms of a church v state separation, because people were scared that rule was actually going to happen. In that kind of a situation where people are adding additional layers of argumentation and additional value to an argument, you tell them, excuse my French, fuck off. Because you can't do that. It's about judging what the individual debater said. You can't take additional material in on board. The second thing that you need to look out for in terms of the debate is people mischaracterizing in the other direction, making an argument seem worse than it actually was. Dismissing argumentation and saying, oh yeah, that argument about the lunar project, that was really interesting, wasn't it? But how was it connected to the debate? I didn't understand. It's not necessarily that you want to fight for a particular team or a particular position, but you want to make sure that all of the adjudicators are reading the arguments at the best possible reading that the teams actually made. And that can sometimes be a difficult balancing act. So what do you do if you get to a situation where 3, 5, 7 or 9 judges all have exactly different readings of the debate? Again, I don't know that there's particularly a correct way to deal with this. The ideal is to get a consensus decision in all cases. If not, you have a round of voting and you decide on a compromise decision. Now that can sometimes be easy enough to do. For example, in this circumstance, I think a pretty good compromise decision would be first, second, third, fourth. Sometimes it won't pan out that easily and you'll have different people calling the first in different places. In those circumstances, you just need to take an extra couple of minutes and work with the panel to come to the decision that best reflects the will of the panel as a whole. You also need to know, though, as a chair or as a panelist, that sometimes other judges are just going to be upset if the result is lodged. They won't agree with it. They'll think that it's wrong in its entirety. That is tough. That is just part of adjudication. At worst, you'll have someone who thinks you're a terrible judge. At best, the other person just has a story they can tell in the bar for the next couple of years. And I'll tell you some of the terrible panel stories that I have later in the bar if anybody wants to hear them. In circumstances where there's just no agreement, just vote and construct a result as best you can. If you're on a panel with an even number and you're the chair, you have casting vote, but that doesn't mean that you can just fill in what you think and completely ignore everybody else. It's not about winning in adjudication, it's about having a discussion and coming to a decision that reflects the panel. So just because you have a casting vote, or just because you're a chair and have the ability to throw your weight around a little bit, doesn't mean that you should try to bully people into agreeing with you for an easy life. If you need more time, take more time. You will have a tab master and a CA at your door screaming at you, but it's more important that you get the decision right than it is you get the ballot back on time so that everything runs. 5 or 10 minutes of a delay isn't the worst thing in the world. A team missing the break of the competition is very important for them. Can be pretty horrific for people. So I would always caution to take as much time as you need. I feel safer doing that now that I'm not running tournaments anymore. The panels will probably disagree, but I don't care. So let's talk about ballots and how you fill them in. Tournament is 1, 2, 3, 4. It's not going to drive the full thing, but this is a rough representation of what your adjudication ballot will encompass. You will have a setup of the debate: first proposition, first opposition, second proposition, second opposition. And this is just for recording the results that you come to. This is only for use at the very, very start of the debate and at the very end of the debate. At the very start of the debate, you want to use it to figure out that you have the 4 correct teams in your room, that you have the 8 correct speakers in your room as they're listed on the tab, and you want to make note of who's speaking in what order. So as a chair, the first thing that you do is look at the ballot, confirm the details, and then ask team 1, is speaker X or speaker Y speaking first? I just put a little mark beside whoever's speaking first. And then I will use that when I'm filling stuff in again later. It's pretty simple. It's only 4 or 5 boxes at most. I think it's only 4 on a tournament ballot. You have 2 boxes for speaker points, for individual speaker points, 1 box for total speaker points, and 1 box for team points. I'll talk about speaker points in a second, but in terms of team points or team position, is it position in tournament? It's position, sorry. So in terms of position, that box is filled in 1 to 4, 1 being first, 4 being fourth, 2 and 3 being the numbers in between those in a progression which you would assume. So you will fill in 1, 2, 3, 4, whichever way the debate is gone. The speaker points are filled in technically from 0 to 100, in reality from 65 to 85, 87, 90 if you're lucky. But they're important because speaker points, in tabbing competitions, you can't have what's called a low points win. So the teams, no matter what way you rank them in terms of position, they also have to be ranked that same way in terms of their speaker points total between the two speakers. So if these guys have gotten a completely average 75 and 75, they have a total of 150. That means the team that came second has to have a cumulative speaker total of less than 150. The team that came third has to have a cumulative speaker score less than whatever that is. If it's 149, they have to take a 148 and then a 147. So the speaker points always have to be reflective of the individual team points as well. That's it. Tabbing is really, really simple. An idiot can do it. But just make sure that you do two things. Firstly, I'm joking, tabbing is really difficult. Firstly, make sure that you get somebody else to check the maths in your speaker scores as well. And secondly, make sure that you pay attention to who's spoken first and who's spoken second. It's pretty obvious if it's a guy and a girl, or if you know the team, but if it's two guys or two girls, you could be destroying somebody's bragging rights over their partner by giving their partner their 82 rather than them. But it also, it can ruin the individual competition too, so make sure that you're assigning the correct speaker points to the correct speaker. How many of you know how the world's ranking speaker points scale works? Right? Yeah. Do you have speaker skills? Oh, go AUDC 2011. I know this one. So, like I said, 100 to 95 is technically the top bracket of scores. You wish to immediately and unreservedly marry the speaker, plausibly one of the best debating speeches ever given in this galaxy, which leaves you virtually speechless. We reserve the right to alert the speaker and her family. Mazel tov. Yoni wrote this, by the way. Yeah. I can't think of an international tournament where a speaker point above 95 has ever been given out. It would be like if God and Jesus and Martin Luther King all combined into one person and had a dream about loaves and fishes, and then gave that in a very structured 7-minute speech. Might be a 94 for a good clash. You're almost never going to see these speeches, but the top of the scale is there because it is the top of the scale. If you're completely blown away by a speech, maybe think around the high 80s. If you ever see a 95, you better have recorded it. Sometimes you will see a speech in the 90 to 94 range. This is brilliant arguments that hit on the main issues of the debate. They're really clear, they're concisely made. The clash is fantastic. Role fulfillment is executed flawlessly. The speech is incredibly compelling. I almost said incredibly fulfilling. This is the kind of thing that you expect to see at the final of the World Universities Championships. This is one of the greatest pieces of oratory ever delivered. Barack Obama's Yes We Can speech is probably pretty high up there, a little bit too gimmicky in terms of the repetition to get it a full 94, maybe an 89, 90. It is almost certainly going to completely destroy anything the opposition has to say. It single-handedly makes all of the incredibly clever arguments in the proposition while pointing out both grammatical and logical difficulties of the motion, and it probably has made you feel ever so slightly sexually excited. Very, very rare. You might see 2 or 3 of those at a tournament like the World Universities Championship a year, and even then, most 90 to 94s are inflation, because judges are really lethargic from judging crap all the time, so when they see something that's even a little bit above mediocre, they go crazy and give it a 92. Very, very, very rare. I've never gotten one. So clearly they don't exist. In 1985, when I first started debating, it used to be an unachievable number. Now it's entirely achievable. Again, this will be the top 1 or 2% of a massive international competition like Worlds. But what you have here are excellent central arguments that engage with the motion really well. They have really compelling analysis on those arguments. But there's something that isn't quite keeping it there. It's not transcendental in terms of the rhetoric. It's not going to make you go out in the morning and sell your grandmother to fight a war against a Kaiser in some country. What you're doing instead is kind of being a little bit workaday. It's inspiring, but it's not necessarily like the big rousing call to arms. It's never going to be in the 20 greatest speeches of the 21st century, but it might maybe be on like a Channel 5 or a really bad TV show, looking back in 50 years' time, where someone's going, yeah, that was a great speech. That was a really terrible analogy. It's the kind of thing that people will talk about, but they won't talk about it for long. How's that? It's okay. It's on the very good side of okay, because things can go down an awful lot from here. But what you're looking for here is somebody, this is probably what you're going to see as an incredible speech. This is going to have really good argument, really good rhetoric, really good logic, but you're just going to feel that there's something missing. There's going to be something that's not quite there that doesn't push it above that. Again, this could conceivably, you could get some speeches in this range at this competition, but it will be top room, getting very lucky and speaking very, very well on emotion that they know lots about. What you're going to see a lot more of are these bad boys. 84 to 80. This is the standard very good to excellent speech. I say standard very good to excellent speech as if that makes sense. It doesn't. This is kind of this speech was very well executed. There were one or two issues with it, but overall it's fantastically well put together. The arguments are really clear. Maybe one or two of them needed a little bit more explanation or a little bit more discussion. Maybe this third point, I don't really understand the connection back to the debate. But in terms of the rest of it, it was all fantastic. It was almost entirely clear. I could almost understand everything and every effect that they wanted to have. And it was compelling, but it wasn't particularly brilliant in terms of its compellingness or the compelling nature of its arguments. So it's the kind of, this is a good speech. I can see it's a good speech. It's an 82, it's an 83. You will see more of these at this competition. I would be surprised if there aren't at least a dozen 80 to 84s handed out. I'd be surprised if there aren't more. But again, just because the ranking is there, that doesn't mean that you have to give it out. So make sure that it fulfills the criteria. And one of these speaker scales that gives it in slightly more detail than me not making much sense will be on the back of every ballot paper or in every room. It'll be in, you'll have it to refer to. The next ranking down is kind of where most of this competition lies. 79 to 75. And start at the bottom. 75 is kind of given as, 75 is the average mark for a debating competition. But average for a debating competition doesn't really mean anything. So instead I explain 75 as being an average speech. What I mean by that is it's equally persuasive and unpersuasive. There's equal amounts of good material and kind of meh material. There's nothing that is actively harmful or actively bad in the speech. But there's a lot of stuff that I don't necessarily, or there's at least half of the stuff in the speech I don't necessarily understand. I don't get why that point is particularly important. I don't get the explanation or the connection back to the motion. So it's kind of 50% of the speech is very well argued and very well explained. The other 50% is just kind of not really there. It's a wash. There isn't a huge amount of value to it. But it's not standing up and going, I think all ants are actually the overlords of the world. And we should stamp out banks because that's where ants live. Like, there's nothing harmful, there's nothing bad, but it's not all good. 79 up towards the top end of that speech then has varying degrees of that kind of meh in it. 79 will have a lot more good material, but again, there's something that's holding it back, and it's probably the presence of one or two of those arguments. Maybe those arguments are slightly more central to the speech than it will be in an 80 to an 84. They've made their main argument and not really connected it, but their two side arguments that they haven't analysed as well are actually quite clever. So it's not going to push them very far down. It might have cost them a team place, but it's still kind of going to get them an average to above average mark. Below that, you have 70 to 74. This is easy as well because it's just the opposite of the kind of 79. There's more material that's not necessarily explained or not necessarily connected as well as there is material that is connected well. And maybe you've got some of that harmful material creeping in. So not necessarily just unexplained material, but the wrong use of material. So saying that the EU is ran by lizards and not really explaining where the lizards come from or if the lizards are actually real. Starting to do damage in terms of your argumentation rather than just not having a positive effect. So everything above here, all of the argumentation has a positive effect or no effect. Once you dip below 75, argumentation is having a negative effect in terms of the speech. Also at this stage, you might have some, or at all stages, but at this stage in particular, you might have some issues with style, where someone is speaking incredibly quickly, somebody is very fidgety, somebody is walking around a lot, lots of excessive hand gestures and gangster symbols for some reason. They're not really making eye contact, they're not talking to the audience, they're talking just to the judges, and they're just talking to that really weird light that kind of looks like an alien upside down. They're not in the room, they're not paying a huge amount of attention. Below that, you're going into 69 to 65, 64 to 60. These are two areas where there is a lot of negative material in the speech. There is much more harm done to the arguments on one side than there is value by this individual speaker. They are talking absolute horse porn. There is nothing of any redeeming quality from this argument, and if anything, it would have been better for their team's position had they just not spoken. Now, they still have spoken, and ipso facto, you have to give them a speaker score, and we don't do negative scores, and you'll find out in a second, we don't really go much further down than this. So, if you give somebody a 60, they are knuckle-dragging Cro-Magnons who really should be up on the UN. Joking, I don't know. So proud. This is like, the 60 is you wish to immediately and unreservedly choke the speaker was the guideline that we gave at Euros, and I think that still holds true. Below that, there are two rankings that still exist below 60. To be honest, they never really actually get entered on ballots. You will have a couple of circumstances. So if you've got someone who speaks for a couple of minutes, like 1 or 2 minutes rather than 7 minutes, they might go below a 60. Or in circumstances where like there is actually no sense. This person just spoke gibberish for 7 minutes. There is no way that I can follow this speech. I can't connect any of the dots. Or it's really unclear what this speech has to do with the debate. If it's someone who's in a bin room or a very low room who's just gotten up and started talking about how they love marshmallows rather than European fiscal compacts, then it might be below the 60 mark. But the one thing that I didn't mention earlier is if you give a speaker score above 90, be prepared to be called out and asked to justify that speaker score to the adjudication team. They will almost certainly want to double check that you're not a lunatic or that you haven't stopped taking your tablets. If you give a mark below 60, you will almost certainly be asked to justify that by the adjudication team as well. So between 59 and 50, that's the low ball. As much as it's a 100-point scale, you never go below 50. I don't know why. I don't know why we don't just have a 30-point scale from 1 to 30. I don't know why we don't just rank speakers 1 to 8. I don't know why we have speaker points. If you can answer any of these questions, answers on the back of the postcard, your world's council. But at some stage we'll figure it out. For now, this is just what we do. It's a 50-point scale from 50 to 100. That's how it works. There isn't such a thing as a 49 or a 45. There also, in the same way as there isn't such a thing as an automatic pass, there isn't such a thing as an automatic 50. Even if somebody is incredibly racially offensive or rude in your room, rank them as normal and rank that material as being unpersuasive. So it might force them down here. It might be a really poor point that you don't take into consideration. You might just look at the rest of their speech. But you don't negatively mark beyond this didn't have a positive contribution or this did active harm. You don't know this was racist. Because those issues are dealt with elsewhere. Those issues are dealt with by equity. They're not dealt with by you in the adjudication room. If there is a negative finding against that person, it is very likely that they will get a 0 and a pair of 50s entered as a result on the tab, but that doesn't mean that the team that came below them in your ranking gets bumped up higher. So you could have two teams that come last in the debate if there are any of those issues. So if you have those issues, ignore them for the sake of the adjudication, or at least ignore them in terms of your personal decision on the debate. Rank the debate as you would any other debate, while finding that material to be problematic or unpersuasive, and then report it and talk about it with the adjudication or with the equity team or the adjudication team. Don't try to predetermine those kind of decisions yourself. as much as we're all sensible people, and you'll probably come to exactly the same conclusion as the equity team if you are in those situations. There's a reason that there's a process for these things to be followed through. Are there any questions in terms of the speakers, Gary?
You're calling for the low margins, so 50 to 60, to justify your decision. If you bring a strangled debater and one more debater that can vouch for our decision to strangle that debater, would that be enough?
Probably, yeah, but you'll also almost certainly be arrested. So I wouldn't suggest that physical harm is a good way to do adjudication of precedent. There are other things that you can do, like knitting. You are still not finished with adjudication, by the way. Yeah.
How do you rank or punish speeches that finish earlier than expected, like 4 or 5-minute speeches?
I would look at them in exactly the same way as I would a 7-minute speech. I would just count up the amount of positive material that was in those 3 or 4-minute speeches. I have in schools competitions judged speakers who have spoken 3 minutes under time and have won the round because they just have better material than everybody else. So it's looking at the positive impact or looking at the impact that speaker's material has had, rather than the impact of them not speaking for the full 7 minutes. And if they've had a fantastic amount of impact in 4 minutes, then they succeed. But it would probably affect their speaker score. It would push them down a little bit because they haven't engaged fully.
In that one, probably the decision is made on argumentation.
Yeah.
When you rank them individually, they can fulfill the role in that 4 minutes, but they don't have any other thing prepared.
Yeah.
So they're sitting down. They have, like, let's say 75, and the speech should have lasted 7 minutes, but it's only 4.
So
Do you take out points from individual?
it'll be a judgment call based on what you think their speech was. So if you think that 4-minute speech was still worthy of a 75, still give it a 75. There isn't they spoke for 3 minutes under time, so there's an automatic 4-point deduction. It's kind of it's very much this is my impression of the speech. So the last thing is feedback, and this is going to be really quick because we've already talked about it a little bit. Feedback is delivered usually by the chair of the panel, except in one circumstance, which is actually going to be the last one. In giving the feedback, there are 2 schools of thought. One of them is wrong, so please never do it. The schools of thought are give the results and then give the explanation. The contrary school of thought is give the explanation and then give the result. The second school of thought is wrong. You should always give the result first and then give the explanation. The reasons why people want to give the explanation and then the result is so they can have people's attention, so they can have an impact in terms of teaching moments. It's all nonsense. You're only doing it for your own sick, perverted pleasure. You should give people the result and give people the explanation for one simple reason. It's not to get it out of the way or to tell people where they can. You can give better feedback when you're comparing teams and telling them why they won or came second or third or fourth than you can in abstract by going, I thought your points were very good, but I thought your points were very good, but your points are also good. I wonder what I thought about your points. They were shit. You get lost. It's the whole thing about adjudications is being comparative. Like I was saying to you earlier in terms of the questions that you want to ask, you want to explain to teams why they took a particular position in reference to the other teams in the debate, rather than isolation in terms of that team. So what I do is I give the results from first to fourth, and then I give my feedback in reverse order from fourth to first. I kind of have a rule of thumb that I try to say something nice about every team, even if one team is awful. You should probably try to do the same so that you're not set out as being the really mean judge that no one likes to see. But it's also usually easy enough to pick out something that a team has done good. You stood up, well done, you spoke, it looked like a debate, you said words, you got the motion right. That doesn't always happen. So you want to explain the reason for the positions in reflection. We thought you did this really well, but the other team who took the third just had more of an impact in the debate, particularly in these arguments, which you could have either built on or replied to. You guys took the third because the second place team did this. So you're never really focusing on what the team has done when you're giving them the feedback. But what you're doing is explaining why somebody was better than the rest of us, like why there was something lacking rather than saying, here were your 3 points. You made this point, this point, and this point. This point you explained in this way. The second point you explained in this other way. The third point we didn't really understand, but we think you meant this. That was not as good as the other team because of this point, this point, and this point. You never want to go back over a debate again. These speakers thought through it as well. They know what happened. What you're giving is an overview of what the panel thought, but doing it comparatively and doing it based on argumentation. You should never have made your decision on the basis of, we gave you the fourth because you have a funny accent, or we gave you the third because you've got nice shoes. If you have done that, you should leave debating, but you should also never say it to the team. The other thing to bear in mind is that you should never go back on your decision. You've kind of reached the decision as a panel. This isn't, it's not binding on you. Well, it is binding on you, but it's not binding on you. It's binding on you as a panel, and you should be able to defend that decision. If you can't defend the decision, don't agree with the decision and dissent on the panel. You can change your mind, or you can talk afterwards to adjudicate or to debaters. But you also, like, you're just getting yourself into a whole world of heartache if you start entering into the, don't you not think our third point and this fourth sub-point was actually really strong, and maybe you misheard us because you were yawning at the time. This is the decision of the panel that you stand by and that you agree with. You can explain it to the team because you are in the room. You had a part in coming to this decision. We have all seen and all absolutely hate the types of adjudicators who go, I think you got it wrong, I think you guys did take the third. It's terrible, it's a shame, you could have been in the final, but you're not, because I have only been convinced now afterwards that all of my friends have screamed at me. Like, that's nonsense. Be able to stand up to the decision that you've just agreed with. But likewise, don't be the team, or don't take it as a judge, or if you've got any influence over the people who are in all the other rooms now who are turning out to be good debaters. Don't be the team that screams at a judge. They're never going to change their mind. The ballot's been gone for at least a minute. It's in the tab system. There's nothing that's going to change the result that you've gotten. So being the surly person who's sitting in the corner kind of glowering at the adjudicator, filling in the feedback form before they've even gotten to your position, throwing spitballs at them and muttering curses under your breath, it is of absolutely no use. Because the adjudicator should be set up to give you good feedback, and you should be expecting good feedback from them. The last thing is in terms of minority decisions on a panel. The chair is not God. If you and the other wing judge agree in a particular way, feel free to vote and what's called roll that chair, where the two wing judges have outvoted the chair's decision, so the chair is in the minority and the wing judge is in the majority, and theirs is the result that stands. Likewise, if you're a chair, accept it. You sometimes get things wrong. There's no point in being huffy and going, do you not know who I am? How dare you try to roll me, the great Manus Shackles. I have been judging debates since you were 4 days old, and I have won 82 competitions in Greece. Because A, nobody cares, and B, you're probably wrong. If two other intelligent individuals think a different way and you're just set in your ways because of ego, you're probably wrong. 2 words of caution. If you are on a wing, and this shouldn't be a word of caution, 2 things to know. If you're a chair and you've been rolled, you shouldn't give the oral adjudication. One of your wings should, because you don't agree with the results, so you can't give a good adjudication. You should never, the second thing is you should never use that as a threat against your wing judges. And if you ever hear somebody going, oh, well, you want to roll me, well, you'll have to give the adjudication then, and giving adjudication is really hard. It's not. You can get some help from the other wing judge. You don't have to be forced into doing it. You do have to give the adjudication. But there's nothing scary about explaining it, because that's all you're doing. You're explaining the result. But that's it. That is pretty much adjudication in a nutshell. Does anyone have any questions?
Like when you're rolling a chair, can you roll on, let's say, on one position, on one team, and agree the rest?
Yeah. So you can have any combination, because it's a consensus decision across the 4 teams, you can have any combination of agreements and disagreements. So the chair could agree on the first, second, third, or the first and the second, and the other 2 judges have the third and the fourth split. That's fine. The chair in that case would give the feedback to the first and the second, and then one of the wing judges would give the feedback to the third. Yep.
So what if someone from the second opposition, for example, brings out a really good point in their POI, but then the first opposition sort of names that point as well? Then how should we work, for instance?
So it's never about seeding the ground in the debate. It's about who has the most developed material. So extensions can happen in one of two ways. They can be new, they can be analytical, or they can be, what's the other word that I'm looking for?
New material.
Yeah, but there's a really nice word for new material.
Ground.
Argumentative. You can have an argumentative extent. That's not even a nice word for new
That's
material. Yeah. So they can, no, but what I mean is they can be a new line of argument, so they can have a whole new area of the debate that they want to look at. Or they can be more in-depth investigations of particular areas of the debate that have happened before. So you can either have a new debate, or you can look at the debate in a different way. I think it's broadening the debate or deepening the debate. I've confused myself. If somebody just name checks a point, it doesn't matter. That it would still count as an extension if the second opposition team has a lot more detail or a lot more analysis on that point. It doesn't need to be a completely new or a completely different argument once there are some completely new areas of argument within what they're saying. Does that make sense?
Yes, but shouldn't it be awarded at all if the second opposition comes up with a point like first?
Oh, yeah, if it comes up in a point of information, it's fine to still award it if it comes up later in more detail. Because remember, in a point of information, they're only going to have a couple of seconds, so they're not going to tease out the argument as fully as they will later. Unless they don't tease it out fully, in which case you don't give it the credit.
Okay.
So if second opposition says, but what about, I don't know, what about Apple laptops? And first opposition then go, yeah, you forgot about Apple laptops, and then second opposition explain what that means. You still give the credit to second opposition. But if second opposition just get back up and go, yeah, Apple laptops, then nobody wins. Apart from Apple, who've just gotten 3 product placements for the price of 2. Any other questions? Does that make sense? Does that make sense? Does that make sense? Do I make sense? It's very existential, isn't it? Yes?
When giving feedback, how often do you go into explaining things that could have been said but haven't been said?
Never.
Never.
Never. Any other questions? So I'll explain that. You can go into you should have said this, but you can only go into you should have said this in reference to what the debaters actually talked about. So if they make an argument about the European Central Bank, you can say you should have talked about the management structures of the European Central Bank. What you can say is, you should have brought up the analogy of Mercosur, because I think you find the banking crisis they had in the late 1990s was very interesting in terms of its parallels of what we're currently experiencing in Europe. That is being a dickhead, and the first one is giving constructive criticism. You never suggest new areas that they should have focused on, or new material, or new kind of points that they could have brought up. What you can suggest is ways that they could have made those points better in terms of the framework that they have. This isn't about it, this is what you said, but you should have said. It's about it, this is what you said, but you could have said it better by maybe talking about this part of your point instead. Does that make sense? Yeah. Anything else?
Sorry, just to pick up on that. Often you get teams actually asking you what you should have said.
Yeah.
So in that submission, you just reply saying what you said.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's not my
Whenever I'm asked by teams, so what would you have done in first problem? My standard response is, I don't know, I was judging. I wasn't sitting there for 15 minutes with my teammate, but I might have said the following. And I would always preface it with this is just my opinion, this doesn't mean that you win the debate. Judges would have had to judge my speech. I am not what I am, but I'm not really infallible. Sometimes teams are satisfied with the first part and don't need you to say the second part. But the one thing is you should never say that in an open feedback. You should say that individually to the teams afterwards if they ask for it. When I first started debating back in 2001, feedback was much more brutal than it is now. And I had a judge once tell me, in front of 7 other speakers, you're just not very good at this, are you? I took a lot of pleasure in beating him in the Euro semi-final 2 years after that. But what you need to be careful about is that open feedback is the kind of things that you would happily say to somebody in front of their mum or their dad. Individual feedback is the kind of thing that you would happily say to one of your friends. And there's a difference between the two. One of them has a lot of potential to upset somebody. Like if you call somebody an idiot in front of their mum or their dad, they're not going to like you. If you call your friend an idiot in private, they're going to be okay with it, right? So you need to kind of err on the side of giving an open and frank discussion of the debate, but not being cruel for the sake of being cruel, or not being cruel in the wrong kind of a circumstance. And remember, if you've got something that you want to say to a team afterwards, you can catch them as they walk out of the room and say it to them in private. Any other questions? Yep.
If you have to decide which one wins, whether like first proposition or the second opposition, but the first proposition started like debating with a premise that is fairly obvious, like for example, like that Christians or like Christian religion often discriminates homosexuals, assuming that the debate will go on towards other points that they don't have to prove the premise. And when the second opposition challenges that, then which one, like, do you have to take account the fact that the first proposition never had the chance to explain their premise, or whether you just vote for second opposition because they sort of attack the argument?
Yeah, it depends. It's kind of, there's two ways that can go. Firstly, it can be a premise that's just alleged by first proposition that they should never have alleged and they should have defended in the first place. So in that particular circumstance, I would say the first proposition should have defended that premise, and you would give the win to second opposition because they pointed out a failing in first proposition. Sometimes it'll be a little bit tighter, or it'll be a little bit more difficult, and you'll have a very clever second opposition who point out some inconsistencies or some difficulties with what first proposition has done. And in that case, I would also give it to second opposition. It's a difficult one because first proposition don't have the opportunity to respond to second opposition, but if it's pointing out a difficulty with the first proposition case, that's something first proposition should have taken care of earlier. That can be more of a problem with first opposition and second proposition, because second proposition get to respond to first opposition, but first op don't get to respond back. And in that case, it's about weighing up the value of their individual contributions to the debate. So, and then looking at the clash element. So how good was the first opposition material in totality, and how much effect did it have in the debate? How much did it persuade you towards the opposition side? Then looking at how much second proposition persuaded you towards the proposition side. Then looking at how much the second proposition material clashes with the first opposition material. And then any clash that first opposition have had back to second proposition, either through their material implicitly, by setting out something that second proposition then respond to, or by POIs, or by the development of their lines of argument by second opposition after second proposition is spoken. So it becomes a balancing act rather than a simple, they said this and then these guys said that. But normally you can see just by looking at the effect of the debate who had the most impact, because either the second proposition challenge to first opposition material isn't as good as it should be, or there's lots of really good first opposition material that second proposition haven't touched on. So you need to be clever when you're looking at those diagonals and figure out where's the actual burden and how far do they go to discharging that. But it just takes a little bit of work.
How much value do you put on the rebuttal in government work?
Government, where?
Seeing that it's the only person that can respond to closing.
It's the only opposition, I was just about to say that exact sentence, thanks Georgie. It's the only opposition to respond to the closing opposition extension speech, but it shouldn't form a major plank of what that speech does. In the same way that the opposition extension should be not a major part of what second opposition are doing. Like, it needs to be different. In terms of a ranking of what the first, second opposition priorities are, the first priority is to respond to what second proposition is extended on. The second priority is to make a response to first proposition and anything that's still left on the table. And then the third responsibility is to deal with the new line of constructive opposition that isn't connected to one of those two first responsibilities, that is an opposition extension. So in terms of what they want to do, opposition extension is quite far down the line, and it shouldn't be a major plank of what they're doing in their case. So it shouldn't require a huge amount of response for second proposition. I would say that it is maybe less than a quarter of the responsibility of opposition or proposition BIP to respond to that. They need to have a response, but it doesn't need to be an extensive response. But it also can be a response that's in their summation. It doesn't need to be an explicit rebuttal. It can be integrated into what their extension is doing as well. Any other questions? Yeah?
When you talk about how much an argument has impact on the debate, is it like how much you as a judge think it has impact, or how much the other debaters think it's important?
In reality, it's both, and sometimes neither. There can be arguments that I think are incredibly important in the debate as a judge that the other two judges don't think are incredibly important. There can be arguments that all of the debaters in the room think are really important, but none of the judges think are important. There can be arguments that all the judges think are key, that none of the debaters touch on apart from one reference. So the reality is it's a balance between all of those things, but the clearest ones are the ones that have an impact on the debaters and how it shapes the debate. What kind of directions it pulls clash material, what kind of directions it pulls extension material. That, I would say, is the primary effect that an argument can have. The secondary is in terms of convincing the individual adjudicators. And then the third one is having no effect at all, of just being like an argument that's had amongst 8 people that goes around in circles because it's not well developed or it's not well explained. So it doesn't go to the judges. So in terms of having impact, number 1 is on the debate and number 2 is on the judges. Any other questions? Okay, excellent. Thanks very much, everyone.